many languages. We can't be sure how many, because sometimes, of course, it's a good tactic to pretend not to understand. He'd seen other climates and other manners. He was interested in all the arts, including the art of living. He was a patron of artists and scholars. He loved gardens, and he aimed to improve them, having plants sent back from abroad in the diplomatic bag. Nothing escaped his improving eye. He obviously didn't think the soft fruit was good enough, because he introduced and indigenized 2 strains of plums. He was a talent spotter, and he'd find jobs for young men whom everyone else regarded as too wild or intractable to take a risk on. And he was a sociable, gregarious man, or at least he did a good impression of one. Above all, he was a very clever man, with a mind that was adroit and original. He was one of those people, and they're rare in any age, who can see the big picture, but can also hammer all the details into place. He could make things happen in the real world. His contemporaries believed that he knew the whole of the New Testament by heart, in Latin, of course. And he's said to have learned it on a journey to Rome. It might have been the same journey that saw him making jelly for the Pope. The fact that a journey was involved suggests that he was employing the classical art of memory, which had been kept alive in Italy, where he may have encountered its techniques as a young man. But even if that story is an exaggeration, he clearly had a formidable memory and intellect. Even if an untrained one, he seems to have been interested in everything. Now, Cromwell was an obviously ambitious man, in an age when ambition was a dirty word. And as he moved through the ranks of government, amassing officers, Master Secretary, Master of the Rolls, Lord Privy Seal, he gathered around him a loosely knit group of men, the commonweal men, ideas men, all of them intent on improving England in some way. They weren't in any sense an advisory body or a group of councillors. They were more like a nebulous shifting climate of opinion through which the minister moved. Some of them were poets, some of them were accountants. Some of them rode around the country in foul weather, splashing through bogs and marshes, and others pored over ancient manuscripts by candlelight till their eyes ached and their eyes itched and their spines ached. Some of them were deeply religious, others were more secular-minded, but they shared an Erasmian humanist outlook, a belief that the world here about us and civil society within it was in itself a worthy object of our attention, that the social and political endeavour was worthwhile. They were concerned with practical as well as philosophical matters, with replanting woodlands, draining marshes, conserving fish stocks, keeping down food prices, limiting the export of raw wool, building up the cloth trade. And sometimes their suggestions seem medieval in their paternalism. Sometimes they seem very modern. It was a huge problem in Tudor society, the enclosure of arable land for sheep farming. This gave rise to rural depopulation and unemployment. And often, of course, the unemployed had no recourse but to drift into begging and vagrancy, and they then found themselves cast as criminals. Now, Cromwell did attempt measures to put more land back under tillage, which he hoped would bring the price of food down. And he tried to limit the number of sheep any one person could own to 2,000. And it was a sort of typical House of Commons fudge that after a little pressure they said, oh, all right, but you know, counting sheep, Cromwell, it's notoriously tricky. So we'll count them by the long 100. That means 100 is anything up to 120. Of course, Cromwell had been a wool trader, and he knew that England's wealth lay in wool. But I think he did see clearly that the poor were economic casualties of this situation, of this system. They were victims, they were not criminals. In March 1536, he introduced into Parliament a radical poor law. And in its original conception, it was an astonishing measure. England needed an infrastructure. It needed roads, harbours, highways. And able-bodied men needed jobs. So put the two together, the need and the supply of labour. The government would subsidise an employment scheme. It would be paid for by a graduated income tax. The rate was left unspecified at the draft stage. And the workers were to have, as well as their wages, housing and medical care. You may think Tudor medical care was a qualified benefit, but the intention was good. Of course, the Tudors were different from us. Their nascent welfare state would have offered tough love. If you were offered 3 jobs on the scheme and you turned them all down, they hanged you. It showed you were a career criminal. Now, along with this scheme for those fit to work was another scheme to relieve the sick and the aged, to be organised parish by parish. Cromwell thought that contributions from the gentry need not be obligatory. That was a flaw. It was said that he himself, from his London house, fed 200 poor people at the gate twice a day, which means that the kitchens must have operated like a factory. He must have assumed initially, at least, that other wealthy men would take their social obligations just as seriously. And Henry himself came to the Commons to plead for this poor law. But no avail, Parliament massacred it, and they left only a pale shadow of those original measures behind. Cromwell didn't give up. In the last year of his life, he was once again trying to tackle the problem of poverty. Now, there were other ideas that would have been revolutionary if enacted. Why not, some of his people suggested, put the bishops on fixed annual stipends and use the wealth of the bishoprics to finance a standing army. You see how these plans are well ahead of history. Now, Cromwell was an optimist, I think, with a measured sceptical optimism, but even he didn't think he could get that one past the King and Parliament. He was a lawyer, but he wasn't a friend to lawyers' incomes. He wanted to modernise and simplify the law. And the Commonweal men came up with a plan in the 1530s for the registration of land. Now, I'm aware to those of you who are not lawyers, this won't sound revolutionary, but it was like putting a bomb under the income and the interests of conveyancers who revelled in the complexities of unregistered title. Because the muddier things are, the more money in it for lawyers. He couldn't get that past the House of Commons. The Commonweal men also thought up a plan to abolish entail, which would have had the gravest effect on the English novel. Because if you think about it, the plot of Pride and Prejudice would have become impossible.